March 1944, south of the Marshall Islands. The air was hard and bright. A white sun hammered flat on the Pacific when a lone G-4M reconnaissance bomber slid along a blue seam of heat haze and cloud. Through salt-fogged binoculars, the Japanese observer steadied his breath and found a sight that defied sense. A task force in parade order. Carriers broad as islands throwing clean, ruler-straight wakes. Cruisers keeping station at textbook intervals. Deck edges glinting like drawn steel. He marked bearings, estimated speed at 15 knots, counted silhouettes, 2, then 4, then more, and thumbed the key. The warning went out in clipped code to Truk Lagoon that American reinforcements were driving for the Carolines. By late morning, the combined fleet had Zeros warming on dispersal pads and destroyers taking on fuel. Staff plotted intercept arcs while coastal lookouts scanned the horizon. Noon brought confirmation prints from the camera. Sharp profiles, tall islands, shadowed gun sponsons where they ought to be. Yet radar sweeps found nothing but the dull scratch of sea clutter, and no slicks or smoke trailed the plotted line of advance. By dusk, the wakes unraveled into featureless chop, and the ships themselves, every last carrier and cruiser, were gone. What the lens had trapped were frames and paint, hull-length skeletons of timber braced under taut canvas, false islands and deck shadows brushed by sign painters, towed in patterns precise enough to fool altitude, optics, and expectation. In after-action notes, American engineers would wryly call the experiment foolproof, the first outing of a fleet that existed only in light and inference. While Japan shifted airfields and pickets toward a battle that never formed, the real work had already begun elsewhere, saws whining, canvas stretching, and a phantom navy taking shape one rib, one stencil, one carefully plotted wake at a time. The story our next section will unmask from the builder's bench. By 1943, the Pacific Ocean had ceased to be a battlefield and had become a labyrinth, an expanse so vast that distance itself became a weapon. Thousands of miles of open water stretched between strongholds, each island a fortress that could devour men, machines, and months. Japan's navy, though bloodied at Coral Sea and Midway, still clung to the central Pacific bastions of Truk, Rabaul, and the Marianas. For the United States, every new offensive meant moving supply lines farther into peril and exposing invasion convoys to reconnaissance long before a single shot was fired. In such an environment, secrecy was nearly impossible. Every plume of exhaust and radio transmission became a breadcrumb, leading Japan's eyes to the next blow. Traditional camouflage, dazzle paint, blackout sails, or coded messages could no longer mask the growing armadas of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Something bolder was needed. Not invisibility, but illusion. The inspiration came from another theater of war. Reports from the Mediterranean told how British engineers had built phantom armies, rubber tanks and plywood aircraft, to fool the Africa Corps under Rommel. American planners under Admiral Chester W. Nimitz studied those successes and saw potential on the waves. If armies could conjure divisions from sand and canvas, why not a navy from driftwood and paint? Thus began experiments at Pearl Harbor and Eniwetok. Floating frameworks shaped like destroyers, canvas-covered barges rigged with dummy masts, even smoke generators that mimicked battle groups under steam. They were never meant to survive contact, only to be seen. From high above, they would appear real enough to trigger alarms. Force redeployments and buy hours, sometimes days of confusion. Japanese intelligence depended heavily on two fragile threads: aerial reconnaissance and long-range submarines. Both could be deceived by clever geometry and sunlight. A shadow on the sea could become a carrier. A mirrored wake could suggest speed and mass. By scattering illusions across the Pacific, the Americans sought to stretch Japan's defenses thin, compelling its admirals to divide fleets and misread invasions before they began. Deception, once a supporting act of war, had evolved into strategy itself, a means of manipulating not just maps but minds. Out of that idea, America's Ghost Navy was born, ready to sail into enemy eyes and vanish before a single shell could find it. Late 1943, Pearl Harbor's repair docks, still scarred from the fires of 2 years before, became the unlikely birthplace of a fleet that would never fight, but would still shape the course of war. Beneath the cranes and rusted hulls, teams of naval engineers gathered planks, canvas, and air bladders rather than armor plate. The first decoys began as skeletons of timber, light enough for a handful of sailors to lift yet vast enough to cast the shadow of a destroyer. Frames of spruce and pine were stretched with tarpaulin, painted in dull ocean grays that caught the Pacific glare just like steel. When towed at 10 knots, their wakes fanned out clean and symmetrical, indistinguishable from those of the real thing. A few prototypes carried heat, canisters disguised in the engine rooms, their warmth detectable on Japanese infrared cameras, a ghost fleet not only visible to the eye but to instruments as well. The effort was codenamed Unit 47, a project quietly tucked under the Navy's Bureau of Ships and guarded with the secrecy of a weapons program. Its success came not from military design bureaus, but from Hollywood's dream factories. Art directors who once built make-believe ocean liners and war epics for the silver screen now found themselves sketching hull lines for war. Using aluminum sheets, cork molds, and rotating radar domes powered by small electric motors, they gave the illusions a pulse. From a distance of 5,000 feet, even veteran reconnaissance crews could not separate wood from steel. Each decoy displaced barely a tenth of a reel. Destroyers wait and could be collapsed or scuttled after its mission, an expendable mirage made to buy time and sow. Confusion. Testing in the calm waters off Oahu proved astonishing. Pilots from the U.S. Navy's own scouting squadrons failed to identify which ships were real, often marking the decoys as combat-ready vessels in their logs. What emerged was a triumph not of firepower but of perception, a new dimension of warfare, where sunlight, shadow, and craftsmanship became tools of strategy. By early 1944, Unit 47's ghost flotillas were ready for deployment under the umbrella of Operation Pastel, set to sail alongside the genuine task forces preparing for the Marianas Campaign, the perfect marriage of illusion and invasion. March 1944, off the Ellis Islands, the night smelled of diesel and wet rope as Task Force 58's carriers steamed north under a low, cloud-streaked sky. From a Japanese scout above, the horizon resolved into apparent tonnage, transports in columns, tugs at their sides, and destroyer silhouettes cutting parallel wakes. The sight sent urgent reports to Truk and set commanders ready to intercept what looked like an invasion. Under cover of darkness, American crews slipped 24 decoys into the swell. Transports, tugs, and destroyer outlines lashed to towing craft. They were devices of craft, smoke pots timed like boilers, tarpaulins shaped to throw proper hull lines, painted decks that caught light, and snapped signal flags to suggest activity. Radio operators fed scripted convoy chatter into bands, so interceptors would assume a live formation. For 48 hours, the Imperial Navy hunted a phantom. Scout pilots circled and logged wakes where nothing floated. Patrols reported formations that dissolved on closer approach. Admiral Koga Minechi diverted air assets from Palau and moved destroyers to intercept patterns that never met steel. Analysts blamed misreads and sensor faults before considering deliberate artifice. That hesitation mattered. Nimitz's carriers seized the opening, striking objectives with fewer enemy fighters overhead and achieving sorties against less defended targets. At dawn, the decoys were rounded up, towed to anchorages, and disassembled for reuse. Engineers refined smoke timing, hull profiles, and towing patterns so future mimicries could ride rougher seas. Among Japanese officers, the vanishing armada seeded doubt into patrols and timetables. Maps that once guided confident responses now carried question marks. The operation proved deception at sea could win time without direct risk, and the next experiment would marry fake ships with radio ghosts and fabricated airfields to deepen the illusion. Planners at Pearl Harbor took careful notes, altering timetables and folding the ghost flotilla into future operational deception plans and intelligence reports. By mid-1944, the war map spread across Tokyo's naval general staff tables had begun to contradict themselves. Red-inked arrows pointed toward phantom fleets, American task forces that appeared near Truk Lagoon in morning reconnaissance photographs, vanished by afternoon, and then resurfaced near the Marianas before midnight. Veteran analysts at the Kure Naval Arsenal, men accustomed to precision, found themselves staring at impossibilities. U.S. carrier groups seemed to move hundreds of miles overnight, multiplying faster than American shipyards could ever build them. Something was wrong, yet no one could agree on what. Reports from submarines confirmed wakes and silhouettes. Aerial photographs matched known profiles. Faced with overwhelming evidence of an expanding U.S. Navy, Tokyo's strategists began to invent explanations that fit the illusion. Some insisted the Americans had constructed a second secret dockyard along the California coast. Others speculated on mass production techniques beyond comprehension. The overestimation crept into every calculation. By summer, Japan's intelligence assessments placed American fleet strength nearly 30% higher than reality. When intercept officers overheard coded traffic referencing Fleet X, they assumed it marked another operational task force and added it to the order of battle. Unaware. It was a deception unit towing decoys through the Pacific. Confusion thickened into paralysis. Admirals, uncertain of where the next blow would fall, tried to defend every island at once. Carrier squadrons were divided. Destroyer screens thinned across Micronesia. Nimitz's deception worked precisely as intended. Japan's resources were dispersed, its punch blunted before the real invasion fleets even sailed. Tokyo's propagandists tried to spin the chaos into pride, proclaiming that America's ghost fleets proved desperation rather than ingenuity. Yet behind closed doors, officers whispered that their enemy now fought with shadows. The confidence once anchored in reconnaissance had begun to erode. Even truth looked suspect, and as June approached, the stage shifted toward the Marianas, where illusion would give way to the roar of the real invasion force. Early June 1944, beneath the tropical haze of the Central Pacific, two wars were taking shape, one of steel and one of smoke. While the real U.S. Fifth Fleet gathered its strength east of Saipan, a quieter mission was already underway, far to the south. Operation Pastel, conceived under Admiral Nimitz's direction, aimed to blur Japan's perception of where the next hammer would fall. On paper, it was a minor diversion. In execution, it became a masterpiece of illusion. From the lagoons of the Ellis Islands, teams launched an armada of deception. Rubber landing craft inflated by hand pumps, wooden cruisers assembled from prefabricated sections, and canvas LSTs designed to throw convincing silhouettes under moonlight. Each night, small patrol boats acting as ghost relays drifted across the sea, transmitting scripted radio chatter, landing timetables, supply shortages, even falsified medical requests. Weather reports referenced non-existent typhoons. Distress calls hinted at imaginary groundings near Ponape. Radar reflectors, simple foil screens mounted on rafts, painted false signatures on Japanese scopes. To a scout pilot peering down through the clouds from Yap or Truk, the illusion was absolute. His camera caught convoys moving toward the Caroline Islands, while another formation, real and massive, steamed undetected toward Saipan. The effect on Japan's high command was paralyzing. Admiral Toyota Soemu, faced with conflicting intelligence, could not gamble his shrinking carrier strength. Believing the Caroline Islands to be the true objective, he held back nearly half of his striking force in reserve. When the American landings began on Saipan on June 15th, resistance from Japan's main air units was fragmentary and uncoordinated. The few counterattacks that followed were crushed in what U.S. pilots grimly dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, destroying more than 300 Japanese aircraft and ending Japan's ability to wage effective carrier warfare. Operation Pastel's phantom convoys had done their part. Without a single exchange of fire, by manipulating Japan's perception, they had tilted the entire axis of the Pacific campaign. Yet success bred new urgency. Nimitz's staff now faced the challenge of keeping the secret intact and scaling the deception fleet for the Philippines and beyond, where the fog of illusion would need to cover entire seas. After the success of Operation Pastel, the U.S. Navy recognized that deception was no longer a sideshow. It was an instrument of war that demanded its own industry. Orders went out from Pearl Harbor to the West Coast, where shipyards in San Pedro, Alameda, and Bremerton received a different kind of commission, not destroyers or escorts, but illusions. The blueprints they followed resembled stagecraft more than shipbuilding. Collapsible wooden hulls, inflatable destroyers, radar domes made from aluminum foil stretched over wire frames. Each section could be disassembled, crated, and shipped across the Pacific like a child's toy waiting to be inflated into menace. Industrial giants joined the masquerade. DuPont engineered lightweight tarpaulin coated with salt-resistant polymers, ensuring the decoys wouldn't rot after weeks at sea. Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, already expert in airships and life rafts, perfected inflatable turrets, gun barrels, and masts that rose and held shape under pressure. Even Hollywood set designers remained involved, painting hull textures and weathering patterns to match combat photography. Cost was no obstacle. The Navy could build a complete dummy destroyer for around $6,000, barely a fraction of 1% of a true warship's price tag. Efficiency was staggering. By the end of 1944, more than 120 deception craft had been produced under the classified program codenamed the Phantom Fleet. Deployment demanded choreography. The ghost vessels were packed aboard real carriers, inflated offshore, and launched at night under strict weather criteria. Meteorologists became part of the deception corps, forecasting cloud cover dense enough to blur flaws, but thin enough to glint off painted decks. Timing was everything. A mirage only worked when the enemy's cameras found it. By December, deception had matured into doctrine. Phantom fleets now shadowed real ones, shaping Japan's reconnaissance like a mirror held to its fears. Yet behind every success loomed a new unease. If illusions could rewrite strategy so easily, what would happen if Japan learned to conjure ghosts of its own? By late 1944, the balance of deception had begun to shift. Stung by the chaos wrought by America's phantom fleets, Japan's high command sought to craft illusions of its own. At Rabaul, where air raids had already reduced much of the infrastructure to rubble, engineers and laborers constructed mock airfields from bamboo and palm trunks. They carved the outlines of Mitsubishi bombers from wood, painted fuel drums to resemble engines, and even arranged glass fragments to mimic runway reflections. From high altitude, the illusion held for a time, enough to draw a few American bomb loads onto empty ground. But Japan lacked the industrial muscle and fuel to sustain such efforts on the open sea. The Imperial Navy's decoy vessels, little more than fishing hulks draped in tarpaulin, could not match the sophistication or coordination of Nimitz's ghost armadas. Radar coverage was patchy, coordination between units erratic, and every gallon of oil spent on illusion starved a real ship of life. Yet even without scale, the deception war took a toll, psychological as much as tactical. Pilots began reporting strange encounters, wakes that stretched across empty water, reflections that looked like fleets. Some swore they saw carriers vanishing beneath cloud banks only to reappear miles away. Others, shaken by exhaustion and superstition, believed the Americans had invented a device to hide ships beneath the waves. Diaries, recovered after the war, described the creeping dread of fighting. An enemy made of smoke and mirrors. This erosion of trust proved decisive. By the time the Battle of Leyte Gulf erupted in October 1944, Japanese commanders hesitated to act on reconnaissance that might itself be a trick. Orders were delayed, counterattacks misdirected, and opportunity slipped away. Deception had matured beyond camouflage. It now lived in the minds of those who feared what their eyes could no longer confirm. From then on, every ripple on the Pacific carried not just threat, but suspicion. By 1945, the Pacific no longer moved by chance or tide. It moved according to illusions. The combined weight of America's deception campaigns had redrawn Japan's strategy maps beyond recognition. Phantom fleets sighted near Truk and Ponape lured destroyer squadrons hundreds of miles from the true invasion corridors. Atolls bristled with defenders waiting for landings that never came, while real offensives, Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, met thinner resistance than expected. Analysts later traced these victories to one invisible advantage: the manipulation of Japanese perception. Deception had matured from experimental art to operational doctrine, a weapon wielded with the same precision as radar-guided bombing. In the Philippines campaign, General Douglas MacArthur's return to Leyte was amplified by a storm of fabricated signals. Dummy landings were staged along Mindanao, complete with false troop broadcasts and simulated landing craft. The Japanese high command, already stretched thin, split its response once again. Each phantom invasion drained real reinforcements from the true front, ensuring that the advancing U.S. forces met only fragments of organized defense. Naval deception no longer merely supported attacks, it orchestrated them. By early 1945, Tokyo's intelligence centers were awash in contradictions. Some maps showed 7 American task forces at sea. Others showed 9. Even code-breaking efforts could not clarify which movements were real, since many of the false operations were deliberately seeded into radio networks that Japan had already compromised. "We fight against an enemy of mirrors," Admiral Toyota reportedly told subordinates, "and every reflection cuts us anew." The turning of the Pacific tide owed as much to artifice as to armament. Industrial power built the ships, but deception multiplied their effect. Every false wake, every phantom convoy, every whispered transmission chipped away at Japan's ability to see the war as it truly was. Yet amid triumph, American planners began to question the line between strategy and illusion, how far one could bend perception before truth itself broke. Within the U.S. Navy, the triumph of illusion carried a quieter burden. Victory had vindicated the ghost fleets, yet among admirals and strategists, unease stirred. To some, deception represented the highest form of efficiency, winning without the butcher's bill, substituting shadows for steel. Others saw something darker, a departure from the Navy's code of honor, where courage had always meant facing the enemy openly. The ethical debate rippled through planning offices and intelligence desks. Could a victory earned through illusion still be called clean? Or did it mark the first step toward a warfare of deceit rather than valor? Reports from the Office of Naval Intelligence revealed further complications. Captured Japanese officers who had mistaken decoys for real fleets faced execution for false reporting upon their return. To some in Washington, this consequence weighed heavily. The architects of deception had not intended to kill through confusion, but the fog they created reached far beyond maps and missions. Still, the numbers spoke loudly. At Saipan, Guam, and Iwo Jima, each phantom operation had diverted forces that might have slaughtered thousands more on the beaches. In that arithmetic, deception became mercy disguised as manipulation. Secrecy, however, was absolute. The phantom fleets remained ghosts even within Allied command circles. Australian and British partners received only vague references to diversionary activity, never the full scale of the illusion that sailed beside them. After the war, files stamped top secret gathered dust in naval archives, while the men who built false ships returned to anonymous lives. When the truth finally emerged years later, historians realized how deeply those shadows had run, across the sea, across strategy, and across the conscience of those who had commanded them. For in the Pacific War, victory had not only been forged in steel, it had been imagined first in silence. As 1945 opened, the Pacific darkened under the shadow of its final and fiercest campaign, Okinawa. The island's reefs and ridges would soon drink more blood than any previous battle in the Pacific. Yet even here, deception moved quietly ahead of the guns. Weeks before the invasion, the U.S. Navy deployed its last great illusion. South of Formosa, in open waters lashed by spring squalls, convoys of dummy transports and landing barges drifted under tow. Smoke pots burned at intervals to suggest engines at work, and pre-recorded radio traffic filled the air with coded chatter about Beach Red and L Day. To Japanese intercept officers on Formosa and Kyushu, the pattern was unmistakable, an impending assault on Taiwan. Orders went out, and kamikaze squadrons rose into the rain, seeking fleets that did not exist. Across March and April, nearly 80 suicide planes found only waves. Some attacked radar ghosts. Others struck decoy vessels crewed by skeleton teams trained to abandon ship once the ruse was complete. For every phantom sunk, an American carrier or transport elsewhere was spared. Analysts later noted that these lost kamikazes represented not only aircraft destroyed in vain, but pilots who might otherwise have turned Okinawa's skies into even greater firestorms. Deception had saved lives, on both sides of the sea, but as the fighting reached the Ryukyus themselves, illusion met its limit. Japan's defenses now relied on radar-directed strikes and coastal observers, systems immune to the tricks of light and shadow that had once ruled the Central Pacific. The ghost fleets faded, their purpose fulfilled, yet their legacy endured in every delayed order, every misread signal, every pilot who chased a reflection instead of reality. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, exhaustion ran deeper than fuel or aircraft. It was the fatigue of uncertainty, the slow erosion of faith in what was real. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the fleets that had fought with shadows disappeared as quietly as they had come. For years, their story remained sealed in classified archives, known only to a handful of officers within the Navy's Bureau of Ships and the Office of Naval Intelligence. Then, in the late 1940s, Operation Pastel and its companion programs were quietly declassified, revealing how imagination had been weaponized across the Pacific. What had begun as an improvisation of wood, rubber, and radio waves would soon echo through the doctrines of a new era. During the Cold War, the lessons of the Phantom Fleet resurfaced in every ocean. Both NATO and the Soviet Union built upon its principles, deploying inflatable aircraft, radar-reflecting barges, and false convoys to conceal submarine routes or mislead surveillance planes. Even the realm of electronic warfare, where radar ghosts and digital jamming replaced paint and canvas, owed its lineage to those 1940s illusions. In military academies from Annapolis to Moscow, the Phantom Fleet became a textbook example of psychological warfare, the art of controlling what the enemy believes to be true. It marked the birth of perception management as a recognized branch of strategy, standing beside artillery, logistics, and intelligence. The U.S. Navy eventually honored the engineers, artists, and set designers who had turned fantasy into weaponry. Their blueprints, once drafted in secrecy, reshaped how nations fought without fighting. From their work emerged a paradox both simple and profound, that in modern warfare, the decisive weapon is not always firepower, but conviction. The ghost ships of the Pacific had shown that victory could be built from nothing more tangible than light and belief. They proved that an empire could fall not merely to force, but to the mastery of illusion. When that Japanese pilot peered through his binoculars in 1944 and saw an American task force that wasn't there, he witnessed more than a trick. He glimpsed the new face of war. What he felt in that moment was not simply fear, but the deeper paralysis of uncertainty. The Pacific, once a vast but knowable chessboard of fleets and islands, had become an ocean of ghosts where the boundary between truth and deception dissolved in the glare of sunlight on water. Every ripple might hide a battleship. Every shadow might vanish into mist. Years later, veterans on both sides would remember the rumors of American ships that disappeared, of fleets that dissolved into the horizon. Historians would trace those legends back to plywood frames, inflated hulls, and the strange genius of those who built a navy from air and illusion. The Pacific War, they concluded, had been won not only with bombs and carriers, but with imagination, an art form practiced with timber, canvas, and deception so skillful it changed the enemy's reality. Today, the Phantom Fleets lie forgotten beneath the sea. Their fragments rotted away or swallowed by coral, yet their presence endures, reborn in every radar echo, every electronic ghost on a modern commander's screen. The war that began with Japan's surprise at Pearl Harbor ended with Japan surprised by shadows. In the long struggle for mastery of the sea, America's most decisive fleet was the one that never truly existed.